Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I got my hands on the latest Snapdragon chip, and so we're going to do some game performance testing in this video. I've been testing the REDMAGIC 10S Pro for the past, 2 weeks at this point. So this is the latest phone, it just released today, and it has the Snapdragon 8 Elite leading version, which is the newest version of this chipset. Now before that, the most powerful chips that I had been testing on Android had been the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 as well as the G3X Gen 2. So the Aya Neo and Odin 2 handhelds and what we've seen there. But these really high-end chips will often debut on phones like they are with this REDMAGIC 10S Pro. And so we're going to take this opportunity to see what this performance is going to look like and how it will apply to handhelds going forward. And so we're going to test things like Android gaming as well as emulation, and then also try out some PC games on Android as well to see how they fare. Without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, to start, this was a review unit sent over from REDMAGIC, but like with all my videos, no money was exchanged in any way. They're not going to see this ahead of time. Now inside the box, we'll obviously get the phone, but then also a charging cable and an 80-watt charging brick, and this thing can actually charge 80-watt fast charge. Let's jump into the specs. We'll talk about the chipset first. So Snapdragon 8 Elite, what they're calling leading version, which is an updated version of the Snapdragon 8 Elite. And it's actually pretty hard to find any information about this online right now just because it is brand new. But the biggest thing I've seen is that the clock speeds are higher than the regular Snapdragon 8 Elite. As far as RAM, you've got a choice between 12 and 24 gigabytes depending on the type of phone that you buy. Same thing with internal storage, 256 gigabytes all the way up to 512. The one I am testing is 16 gigabytes of RAM as well as 512 gigabytes of storage, so kind of middle of the pack. The display is very impressive. It's an AMOLED panel and it is 6.85 inches with a resolution of 2688 by 1216. They call this a 1.5K resolution. It also has an aspect ratio of about 21:9. It also has a 144 Hz refresh rate and a 95.3 screen-to-body ratio. It's kind of crazy how these phones look nowadays. I mean, this thing is just all screen. You can barely see anything that isn't screen in the front. Here it is compared to my iPhone 15 Pro non-max version, and you can see that this one also doesn't have like one of those camera islands like we have on the iPhone. So I really like the clean look of the REDMAGIC. The battery is 7,050 milliamp hours, and it also supports an 80-watt fast charge. We will do some battery tests near the end of the video. Also, in terms of connectivity, it supports dual SIM 5G as well as Wi-Fi 7 and then Bluetooth 5.4. It's also running Android 11 and has dual cameras, 50 megapixels on the back and then 16 on the front. Now, before we jump into the performance testing, I did want to show a little bit more about this phone in case you are in the market for something like it. I actually reviewed an older REDMAGIC phone. It was several years ago. I think it was the REDMAGIC 7. So this is not my first phone from this company, but definitely my first with like an Elite style phone since then. And as far as a standard cell phone, it's probably got a lot of the things that you would expect. So like on the bottom, you've got your USB-C port, you've got your SIM cards right here, and then you've got one of your two speakers. The other one is on the other side. This company thankfully has not gotten away from headphone jack, so that's a nice thing to see as well. But there are some unique characteristics to REDMAGIC phones. Number one is the fact that it has active cooling, which you often will not see on a cell phone. So that is the fan right here. It actually kind of looks like a camera. And then you can see this is the exhaust right here on this side. And then we've got the intake here on the opposite side. So it's actually pulling in air and cooling it. Another thing I like about this phone is that it has no camera bump. So everything is actually installed directly in the phone. It is absolutely flat. Speaking of which, this is also a very blocky phone. You can see that it just doesn't really have a lot of curve to it. So it just kind of feels like holding a slab, like a chunk of glass and metal. It's also worth noting that this phone is kind of a mid-cycle refresh of the original REDMAGIC 10 Pro. And so you can actually just go online and find cases for the 10 Pro, and they're going to fit this one as well. There's very little difference between the two other than that new CPU as well as a bit of liquid cooling that's been improved. Another thing that sets this phone apart is that it's very gaming focused. If we look right here, we've got these two shoulder buttons. So these are just like touch buttons. They're 520 hertz, so ultra fast responsive. But the thing is, if you're playing, like a touch-based game, say, for example, like Call of Duty or whatever, and you don't have a controller with you, you can use these, and they're programmable in their software. Speaking of which, that's the other thing that I wanted to mention is that their software is also gaming-focused, too. They've got this little switch right here on the right side. If you flick this on, it's actually going to go into gaming mode. It's got like sound effects and everything. It is very cheesy. And when you're in this mode, you can actually assign all of your software here on the left side, so you can actually just launch all of these as if they are a game, which is going to prioritize performance. And when you're in a game, you can actually swipe over from one of the sides and it'll actually bring up this whole menu right here. It gets a little bit crazy. So here you can actually adjust things like the fan on the fly. You can also like clear out your cache and your RAM. You can also adjust the refresh rate of your display if you want to do 60 or 120 or 144 Hertz. And then you can also adjust the CPU power mode. The phone has 3 different modes that we will test in this video, including a balanced mode, which we'll use for the majority of our stuff, but then they have their high performance mode, or what they call Rise. We will also test this one. So it's almost like the phone has its own built-in gaming hub where you can adjust things on the fly, which is a lot better than trying to swipe down from the top. And so I have been using that from time to time. So really, I just wanted to show off a couple unique things about the REDMAGIC 10S Pro in case you're in the market for a gaming phone. I'm not an Android phone reviewer, and so I don't think I can give this really a fair shake against the competition just because I'm not really well versed in this whole world. But I will say from my own perspective of just using it over the past couple weeks as my main phone, it's been great. You know, I think I would want a case for it. So I would probably go on Amazon and get something that just gives it a little bit more protection. But other than that, I haven't had any problems. It feels very zippy. My only big annoyance about this phone is that it wants to remind you all the time that it's a gaming phone. So if you turn on the fan, it'll actually make car sounds starting up just so you can cool off your device. And it just gets a little bit on my nerves over time. Same thing with if you start up any game that's considered a game, it's going to give you this like little thing right here that's called the energy cube. It's going to let you know that it cleared out the RAM before you started your game. I don't need a reminder of that all the time. But those are really minor annoyances for a phone that's really impressive. I mean, look at the size of this screen. It's just crazy compared to the size of the body. And yeah, I think that it's a wonderful display as well. If we compare it to something like the Odin 2 Portal, I think it is just as impressive in terms of the colors and the richness and vibrancy. And it's also a nice big display. Now, it's not a 16:9 like this one. And so if you were to actually compare it between the two, then yes, the Odin 2 is going to be taller. It's going to give you more screen real estate in that regard. But there are some advantages to having an ultra-wide display, which we will talk about later. It's also worth noting that even though it's rated for 2000 nits peak brightness, it is nowhere near as bright as something like the Odin 2 or the Retroid Pocket 5 at max brightness. Now, that being said, in my daily use over the past couple weeks, I've had no problems using this thing outdoors, but it is something worth noting that this is not quite as bright as some of the other handhelds we have on the market today. Now, in my performance testing, I used 2 different controllers, and the first one here is the GameSir G8. This is about maybe $60, $70. One of my favorite controllers as far as USB controllers go. Now, this one kind of feels like an Xbox controller broken in half, and so I like the feel of it. It has very console-like, and then also I love the fact that it's basically flush between the phone and the controller itself, so it feels almost like a single piece. It's a really impressive setup. Now, the other controller I've been using is the Backbone Pro. This one's a lot more expensive. It's like $170, and it's very hard to recommend at that price point, but it also fits very nicely. What I like about this one is that it feels a lot more compact and more lightweight, and so this has been a really nice fit as well, just because I like the combination of these two. But if you're in the market for a USB-C controller and money is a factor, then absolutely get the GameSir before this one, because this one is like 3 times more expensive. Okay, now I want to jump into performance benchmarks, and I'm going to compare it directly against what is arguably the most powerful Android-based handheld available today. It's the Odin 2 Portal with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. So this chipset is 1 or 2 generations behind what we have in the REDMAGIC, but I want to see what the difference is between the two. We're going to start with a GPU-intensive test of 3D Mark with the Wildlife Extreme Stress Test. This is a 20-minute test running in 1-minute loops. And you can see with the Odin 2 Portal, it is a very stable performer, about 3,700 as its loop score, and we have about 98% stability. And so this is rock solid and consistent performance when it comes to playing at the higher level. Now, I did the same test with the REDMAGIC phone at its highest performance level and doing that 20-minute cycle. And the performance on this one is very different. You can see that it had a high loop score of 6886. That's the very first loop. But then after that, it dropped down a bunch, down to 3200. And that gives it a stability score of 46.5%. And you can see there's a really big dip here in the graph. So it starts out really performant, and then as it keeps going, it starts to dip quite a bit. And then there's just a huge drop here around the 12-minute mark. And it went from 5773 down to 3573. From there, it bottomed out at 3200 and then kind of climbed back up and then got stable after that. So really the stable performance we're looking at is around 4300 instead. And so that's what you can expect over over a long-term gaming session is something that's about 500 points better than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 once you get to a stable moment. Now, if you're only going to be playing for about 10 minutes, then yes, you will get some really awesome gameplay. But again, around that 12-minute mark is when the thermals really start to kick in and things do tank quite a bit. So your gameplay experience is going to vary depending on whether or not you're playing in the highest performance mode like this, and then also how long you are going to be playing during your game session. It's also worth noting that the phone does get quite hot. You can see that, 57 degrees is the hottest that it got during this testing. Meanwhile, on something like the Odin 2 that has, a much better thermal profile because it has a lot bigger fan, it got up to 35 degrees at its max temperature. Now, I also ran this test at the regular performance mode, and this one actually performed quite a bit better in terms of stability. You can see here, it's about 65% as opposed to 46% with the other mode. And this one started at a lower loop score and then just kind of stabled out around 3,800 after that. And so there is going to be a difference once these stabilize between the regular and high performance mode. This one will be around 3,800, at least in terms of this wildlife score, whereas the other one was around 42 or 4,300. And so what this means to me is that even though the high performance mode is less stable than the low performance mode, when you're actually talking about whatever stable performance you get, it's still going to be quite a bit higher on the high performance mode after everything balances out. But it's also worth noting the regular performance mode is not as hot, so it only runs at 42 degrees Celsius at the max compared to 57 with the other score. Okay, let's take a look at benchmark scores with Geekbench, and I'm running the same app and in the high performance mode for both of these devices. So I have the Odin 2 Portal here, and then obviously the REDMAGIC. And you can see there's a big boost in performance, about 50% better than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 in single core, and nearly 100% better in a multi-core score. And these scores add up to what I would expect with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. If we look at the actual Geekbench database, you can see that phones that have the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 are a little bit lower than the Odin 2 Portal, which makes sense because this has a lot more cooling. So you can see that yes, when it comes to Geekbench scores, it is a lot better on the Snapdragon 8 Elite. However, there are two things to keep in mind about these scores. Number one, this is a relatively fast test. It usually takes about 3 or 5 minutes to actually run, which means that thermal throttling issues, like we saw with 3D Mark, may not be apparent with something like Geekbench. So this is kind of a best case scenario. And then also keep in mind that even though this Snapdragon 8 Elite leading version has a higher clock speed than the regular Snapdragon 8 Elite, these scores are about the same as they are in the Geekbench database. So even though this is running at a higher CPU frequency, the real-world results are about the same as your standard Snapdragon 8 Elite. One other thing to keep in mind is that when running this device at its regular performance mode, as in not in the highest performance mode, you can see that it actually is around the same as the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. And for me, this is more impressive because that means that I don't have to overheat the device and, drain the battery really quickly to still get very good performance. So when it comes to benchmarks, I think it's very impressive. This phone obviously is the most powerful one that I've seen before, and a lot more powerful than the handhelds we have on the market today. But there is a trade-off there in terms of battery life as well as temperature. We'll talk more about battery life near the end of the video, but let's talk a bit about temperature next. And I'm going to show two different scenarios. The first is going to be a worst case scenario when it comes to thermals, when you're really pushing the device as far as it can go. So here's that 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme test that we were talking about before. And when running this test, it does get very hot like we saw in the specs earlier. And the phone itself gets very hot when running a benchmark. It's about 52 degrees Celsius on the front of the panel. And that's about 125 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is very, very warm. It's not going to burn you, but it definitely feels almost scalding. And the heat is not just on the front of the device, but along the sides as well. It is very hard to hold. Now, thankfully, when you are pushing it that far, you're probably going to be playing a game, which means that you will have a controller strapped to it. And so the heat doesn't really transfer over to that controller, so it's not an actual issue while you're playing, but something to be mindful. This thing does get very warm. It's also very hot on the back, but not as bad as the front, about 50 degrees Celsius, and that is close to where the CPU is. And again, this is a worst case scenario, so if you're pushing the device as far as it can go and you're running it for about 20 minutes, this is what you can expect. Now, in an actual gameplay scenario, you probably won't be pushing it all the way to the max like this, and so I have not found these same temperature problems when actually playing a game, which is honestly when it's really going to matter. So after about 10 minutes of playing an Android game here at highest settings, it's only about 32 degrees Celsius here on the front. And that'll be about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is still warm to the touch, but definitely not hot feeling. Now the back does get a little bit warmer near the CPU. It's about 34 degrees Celsius, but again, nothing to be alarmed about if you ask me. Another thing I found that got the device very warm is its 80-watt fast charge. I mean, it's really impressive that it can do this, but I'm not really sure how quickly I need to charge my phone in a moment like this. Now, when the charging starts, the fan does kick in, but the battery itself is probably what's causing a lot of this heat, and so I'm not sure how much the cooling fan is actually cooling the device down, since this is more aimed at the CPU. So what I've been personally doing is not actually fast charging this phone, just because, man, it gets really warm just charging it. And again, I'm not really ever in a position where I need to have it charged in 20 minutes. But if you are in a situation like that, it's nice to have it. But personally, I've just been not using their 80-watt charger and trying to get a little bit slower of a charge instead. You've got a couple options directly on the phone, so you can go in and turn off the turbo charge. That's going to make it not charge quite as fast. And you can also turn on charging separation, which means that as it's charging, it's not going to pull from the battery, it's only going to pull from the AC, which is going to be great when you're trying to play a game. Another thing you can do is just charge it pass-through a controller, because that's not going to support 80-watt charging. And so that's another thing I've been doing, is just charging it through the controller itself, which has been on it for a lot of the time while doing this testing. Okay, now let's jump into performance testing. I'm going to start with just Android gaming and what that experience is going to look like. And I think my big takeaway here is that, Android gaming on this feels very similar to what it would be like on any other Android phone that's at least a little bit more modern. One of the bigger things I like to look for is whether or not the game is actually going to run in an ultra-wide display aspect ratio like we have on this phone. And, most modern phones have this as well. And so a lot of these games are adapted to it, and it's a very impressive experience. In particular, I really like playing platforming games like this just because I can see so much of the map. So something like Dead Cells is a real joy to play on here, as it is with any other modern Android phone. Now, moving into the games that are harder to run, something like Genshin Impact, absolutely no problem here. I put it at the very highest settings that I could find within the settings menu, and yeah, it was working great. I also love the fact that this natively supports controllers now, and so it's as easy as just plugging in my controller, going into the settings, and then changing it to a control mode. I also really enjoyed playing games like Call of Duty Warzone. Now, again, that widescreen aspect ratio allows me to see a lot of what's going on, but also, just the vibrant OLED display made everything look very good. Now, this is a game that shows a lot of browns just because it's kind of in a decrepit area, but still very beautiful to look at. And again, at the highest settings that I could find, no problem whatsoever. Now, unfortunately, this chip is not compatible with the ultra resolution settings in Diablo Immortal, at least right now. This is something I hope that they will fix in time as this chipset gets a little bit more prevalent, but as it stands right now, we had to play it in high settings, and honestly, it still looked very good, and so this is also probably another way that you can play this phone. So really, when it comes to Android gaming, I was very impressed with the overall experience. I think that the screen looks amazing, and then also, any game that I actually tried played at full speed, no problem whatsoever. So again, I kind of was expecting this, just given the fact that, a lot of these games are optimized for lesser chipsets. So the fact that it's running so well is not surprising to me, but it is nice to see. Another thing I really enjoyed that's not specifically Android gaming is game streaming. So I played a lot of GeForce Now over the past couple weeks, and it's been a really impressive experience because a lot of these PC games have ultra-wide support. And so I'm able to play these games at 120 frames per second and with ultra-wide going. And so it's been a wonderful experience if you are into game streaming as well. It's obviously not the same as playing a dedicated handheld because this is a phone with controls slapped on each side, but when you use something really high quality like the GameSir or that Backbone Pro, it's a really excellent experience. And so I've enjoyed this a lot too. Now, as far as emulation goes, I did set this up in the exact same way that I would any other Android-based handheld. So I configured all my emulators, I set up a front end like this, and so I'm able to jump in and out of my games with relative ease. And of course, some systems are going to be a better fit with this type of screen than others. So for example, something like Game Boy Color is not really my first choice when it comes to playing these games. So instead, I would recommend trying out wider systems in particular with a widescreen phone. And a lot of these emulators will have widescreen hack options. And so, for example, here I'm playing Dreamcast Sonic Adventure 2, and man, look at how wide this is. It's kind of crazy, and I think it looks pretty awesome. Another thing to keep in mind is we can set this screen to 120 Hz refresh rate, which means we can use black frame insertion within RetroArch. That's going to give us improved motion clarity as we're playing some of these retro games. So it's really nice to be able to play that on a phone as well. But I will say that the majority of my time was spent playing higher end systems than the retro stuff, just because this is a chipset that I was trying to test in terms of performance. So let's talk about some of that stuff in that experience. We're going to start with Nintendo GameCube. So here I have turned on widescreen hacks and then stretched stretch it to full screen, and a lot of these games will adapt to this wider aspect ratio. And I'm running these games at a 4x resolution upscale, which is going to max out the resolution on the display itself. And as expected here, the performance is absolutely great when it came to Nintendo GameCube. I really enjoyed it, and some of these games look really amazing with this ultra-wide hack. But it is also worth noting that some of these games look a little bit weird or wonky when you stretch them all the way like this. So here is Super Mario Sunburn. So this is a hack of Super Mario Sunshine, which actually has a 20:9 aspect ratio option within its settings. And I found that this is just so wide and kind of fish-eyed looking that it was giving me a little bit of motion sickness as I was playing it. So I think with a game like this, I would prefer just to play with 16:9 and have light bezels on the left and right. Regardless, from a performance standpoint, you will be able to play all GameCube and Wii games absolutely fine as long as they are compatible with this chipset, and as far as my testing went, all of them were. And it was a very similar setup when it came to PlayStation 2. So again, turned on widescreen hacks and then pushed this all the way to stretch the frame to the entire screen. And yeah, a lot of these games adapted to that. I'm running all these games at a 4x resolution again, and yeah, no problems when it came to performance. It's also worth noting that I'm playing all these systems in balanced mode, so not even in the high performance mode. I'm just kind of leaving them as they are. So again, when it comes to Gen 6, PlayStation and GameCube, no problems here. You can play everything up to a 4x resolution upscale, and again, not having to push the performance either. Another system that worked out really well was Nintendo Wii U. Now, I'm going to blur out some of this footage because it is Nintendo IP, and they don't like me showing this system. I've gotten copyright strikes before for showing Wii U gameplay. But one of the nice things about this emulator is that it has a graphics pack option for some of these games, which allows you to adjust the resolution, which includes the aspect ratio. And so for games like Wind Waker HD, as well as Twilight Princess HD, absolutely fine performance here. And again, I'm playing these in balanced mode and still working just fine. These are running at just a 1080p resolution. You can upscale them a little bit further if you would like, but at that point, I would recommend turning on performance mode. And the performance mode will make a difference when playing some of these games. For example, here is Breath of the Wild, playing it at the regular balanced mode at a 720p resolution, but in an ultra-wide aspect ratio. The average frame rate here is around 18 frames per second, which to me is a little bit too slow to be playable, and so I found this to be very sluggish. Now, if I go into the phone settings and turn on performance mode, it is a lot better, somewhere between 25 and 30 frames per second on average, which I found to be completely playable. So for me personally, I would play this game with these settings with this phone, but I would want to turn it into game mode or the high performance mode just so I can get the most juice possible. It's going to drain the battery a little bit faster, but I think it's well worth it for this improved gameplay experience. Okay, moving along, I tested PlayStation 3 with RPCSX. This is a new PlayStation 3 app available on Android, and it actually works pretty well. The installation process is very similar to how you install games on PC using RPCS3. Now, this is a very early emulator app, and so a lot of the issues are not really going to come from the performance here, but rather compatibility, just because, it takes a while to get all this stuff up and running. When it came to lightweight games, especially those that have been tested heavily over the years, including Afterburner Climax, yeah, these games are running just fine. However, there were some lightweight games that did present some problems. For example, Daytona USA. This one played pretty well from a performance standpoint, but was heavily glitched. So hopefully this one will get better over time, but as it stands right now, yeah, it's a little bit too buggy for me to actually play. I also had another issue with 3D Dot Game Heroes, which I was hoping would work, but unfortunately, as soon as the game actually started, it just booted into a black screen. And I also saw a similar problem with some of the disc-based games, those that are a little bit more on the high end. So, for example, I thought it would be really cool to be able to play Prince of Persia, the PS3 version, but unfortunately it doesn't get into the actual game. When you start up a game, it's going to show a white screen and then just crash back into the menu. So hopefully the compatibility on this one will improve in the future. And again, I think this is all just a compatibility issue and not necessarily performance, because I was able to get some heavyweight games to actually run, including Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty. This game is actually pretty hard to run on PC, so the fact that it was running on an Android phone was pretty crazy. Now, it was a little bit sluggish, like I was feeling some slowdown here and there, but still, I would say this is almost playable. And the fact that we're this far along with a PlayStation 3 emulator that just debuted is pretty impressive. So I'm hoping that, maybe a year from now, this will be a really excellent experience with this emulator as long as the team keeps going with it, and I hope they do. Now let's move on to Nintendo Switch emulation, and this is where things get a little bit tricky. I was hoping that, I would just be able to install all the apps that I usually use on, for example, the Odin 2, and then run my latest turnip drivers and everything would work out well. What I didn't realize is that turnip drivers are actually not available for the Snapdragon 8 Elite chipset just yet, and so this is one of those things that even though it has more raw power, a lot of the older chipsets are actually better because they have more compatibility and they work with those turnip drivers. There are a lot of Nintendo Switch emulators out on Android right now, and each of them have their pros and cons, but the two that I stuck with for this video in particular are Eden as well as Kenji NX. Now Eden is a fork of Yuzu, and a lot of the members are from other apps that we've seen before like Citron and Sudachi, and so this one is still a very early emulator, but it's actually working very well, especially when it comes to compatibility. Now, Kenji NX is actually a Ryujinx fork. So Ryujinx closed up shop, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 months ago. And during that time, they released a beta of their Android APK. And so this team has actually taken that beta and then improved upon it. And it's only been out for a few weeks at this point, but it is also very promising. And so those are the two options that I tested here in this video. I'm not going to leave any links to either of these just because I don't want to bring additional attention to them, but they are very easy to find via Google if you want to find them there. We're going to start with the Eden emulator. So this is the Yuzu fork, and there were some games that worked pretty well. For example, Portal 2 is a game that's actually pretty intensive. It's one of the harder Switch games to run on the platform. And from a performance standpoint, I found no problems here. There were some shader issues I think that I saw graphically, just because the fact that it looked a little bit darker than I was expecting in some areas. So it may be that some textures are not loading correctly, but otherwise I thought it was a pretty good fit. Now, unfortunately, that's about the only good Switch game experience that I had with this emulator, because this one really relies on those third-party turnip drivers, which unfortunately do not load on this emulator. So the vast majority of games that I played were unplayably bad from a graphical standpoint. For example, with Hades, the lighting was all off, and so I didn't think this was very good. Same thing with like Mario Kart 8. You can't even see the kart or the cars themselves, and so this is a terrible experience. I would not recommend it. Same thing with Super Mario Odyssey. This one does not show the majority of the textures, to the point where it's very hard to see what you're doing and you can fall off a cliff at any time. Now, Super Mario 3D World and Bowser's Fury had their own set of issues. So this one would actually not show anything when you were facing a certain direction. But if you faced a different direction, you could see everything just fine. And so again, this game is like half playable, which really means it's unplayable for me. Another game I tested was Link's Awakening. And yeah, this one also had all sorts of issues. The textures were not loading correctly, so the lighting was all off. But the performance was actually pretty good, 60 frames per second when in handheld mode. So this is a game that's fun to play, but not fun to look at. Now, the Ryujinx fork, Kenji NX, actually did a lot better. I was really surprised because, again, this one doesn't load any special turnip drivers either. But out of the box, I found that a lot more games were compatible. So Portal 2 looked to be showing all of the correct textures, so it looked very good. And thankfully, the performance was full speed as well, so this is a really fun experience. Same thing with Hades, the lighting was correct on this one. I did get some stutters here and there with this, and I think it's probably a emulation and compatibility issue as opposed to performance, but yes, this was very close to being a perfect experience for me as well. Mario Odyssey also played correctly, so all the textures looked really good, and it was performing at full speed, even in docked mode. And I'm happy to report that the weird glitch with Bowser's Fury was also not there, so this was fully playable too. Now, Link's Awakening was the opposite experience. This one looked very good. All the textures were working fine. I got a couple stutters here and there when it came to like graphical flashes, but otherwise I thought it was great. The issue here was performance, because even in handheld mode, this was not playing at full speed, which is kind of unfortunate because Eden, the Yuzu fork, was playing at full speed. So I kind of want to make a baby between the two to be able to get both good graphics and good performance. So I think that if you are going to try Nintendo Switch emulation on the Snapdragon 8 Elite chipsets, then it's worth checking out the Kenji NX Ryujinx fork. Like I said, this one's only been out for a few weeks and they just released a new update yesterday. And so this one is still very much a work in progress, but it is coming along nicely. So now let's talk about playing PC games via compatibility layers through apps like WinLater and GameHub. Now, unfortunately, WinLater is very similar to these Switch emulators in that it does not have compatibility with the Snapdragon 8 Elite chipsets. So there are ways to brute force into WinLater, but I found that I got a lot of similar graphical problems like I did with Nintendo Switch. So instead, I focused my testing on GameHub, which is a very similar app, but has a couple caveats to it. Now, number one, GameHub is made in conjunction with GameSir, which is a Chinese-based company. So this app is China-based. And the way the GameHub works is kind of magical. So it has its own compatibility layer, and you're able to sign into your Steam library and then download your actual Steam PC games onto the phone and then launch them through that layer. But again, I do want to caution that this is a China-based app, and so I'm a little bit hesitant to recommend this app just because, you never know what you're giving your Steam login credentials to. So I was very careful about how I downloaded my apps and put them onto the machine, but I did want to give you a little bit of caution about that. Now, the reason why I did try out GameHub and the Game Fusion compatibility layer is because it does have support for the 8 Elite. If we go into the game settings, if we go into the compatibility sections and then GPU driver, there are a number of Snapdragon 8 Elite GPU drivers that you can test. And so this is the one thing that makes it stand apart from Winlator, at least right now. I think that a year from now, we'll probably have a lot of other options, but I did want to mention why I tested GameHub specifically instead of Winlator for this video. And again, this is not an endorsement of the app. I have a little bit of caution when it comes to giving your Steam credentials to an overseas company, but something to think about here. That being said, I was impressed by the Game Fusion experience when it actually worked. The first thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these game files are going to be huge. They're PC game files, so it can be upwards of 10, 30, 40 gigabytes per game. And there are definitely some bugs that need to be worked out. For example, with Hades, this one launched absolutely fine, but I could not get any controller to actually work with it. You would think a GameSir controller, which made the GameHub app, would actually work with it, but unfortunately no, this didn't work. And that can be frustrating when you download a 10 gigabyte game file to find out that it doesn't work at all and you have to delete it anyway. Because of those large game file sizes, I was not able to download a ton of games, but one game that I was able to test correctly was BioShock. And I was surprised to find that this one did play really well. I'd say the average is about 30 frames per second. It would dip down below that, and you can feel that, especially within combat, but it was really exciting to be able to play these games. The average frame rate was about 30 frames per second, and it would definitely dip down below that, sometimes to like 25 frames per second, but often above that as well, to like 40 frames. And there was definitely a thrill in being able to play a full-on PC game on an Android-based device, so this was pretty cool. But I think personally, I think it's more of a novelty than anything, just because this device does not have a microSD card slot, so you're limited to the internal storage. And so even though this was a 512 gigabyte internal storage phone, it still filled up very quickly while trying to test some of these games. So it's definitely not something that you can put your whole PC library on, but it might be worth it to try one game at a time to see if it'll install and then also if it'll actually run. And when it does, it is a pretty magical experience. It feels like you're cheating. And it's also impressive that this chipset can keep up with a full-on PC game that was never meant to be played on an Android phone. So I think when it comes to things like Winlator and Game Fusion, this is going to take a little bit more time and testing. I think that really a year from now, we'll get a better feel for how this is working. But if you want to be on the bleeding edge, to have a really nice chipset like this, and to really kind of test this performance, then this is a niche that I think is very exciting. Okay, that's really about it when it comes to performance. Now let's talk a little bit about battery life and what you can expect. Let's start with a worst case scenario, which is running a benchmark, maxing out the phone as much as you can until it dies. This is obviously not a very real world case scenario, but it is nice to see how bad it could possibly be. And when running the Wildlife Extreme benchmark, I got 2 hours and 13 minutes total of battery life. And so that's the worst case scenario when you're pushing this device as far as it can go the entire time. For the other ones, I actually tested games to see how they work. So let's talk about Wii U next. For this one, I ran Breath of the Wild, again in high performance mode, so pushing this as far as it could go, but with an actual game. And this actually pushed the performance more than any other app that I found. So this one ran at about 3 hours and 2 minutes altogether with Breath of the Wild. So again, about 3 hours at max. Now for everything else, it was a little bit better. For example, with BioShock here running in high performance mode, I got a little bit over 4 hours and 10 minutes altogether. I was also surprised to find that Nintendo Switch did not push this chipset as far as I thought it would. So for example, with Link's Awakening on Eden, this is the one that performed well but looked bad, I got 4 hours and 46 minutes of battery life. And I think a lot of this had to do with the fact that most Switch games played just fine in balanced mode. It didn't require high performance mode, which did save in battery life. And then finally, just one other test here was with PlayStation 2 and Jack 3. So this is running at a 3x resolution here, and it was easily playing at 60 frames per second in balanced mode. The battery life on this was also pretty great, 5 hours and 33 minutes to be able to play this game. So altogether, I would say these battery numbers are actually pretty impressive. None of these are going to be all-day battery life if you're just going to be playing gaming on it, but I think that if you're just going to be jumping in and out of games while also using it as a phone, this is going to be a pretty great experience. Okay, so wrapping things up here, just talking about my performance and the experience with it, I would say that I came away pretty impressed with this from an Android gaming perspective, at least when it came to pure power. There were definitely compatibility issues on the emulation side, especially because many of these are very early. For example, some of these Switch emulators, as well as like PS3, these just need a little bit more time to bake. The thing I learned from this is that when you're testing high-end emulation, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It is really neat to have the performance power of these high-end chipsets, but it does come at a cost, and that has to do with compatibility. And so in many cases, it makes sense why a high-end emulation machine like the Odin 2 actually uses an older and more prevalent chipset, because all of the work in terms of compatibility is kind of already been done at that point. All of these smartphone elite people have already kind of tested all those waters. And now when you get a handheld, it's already working out of the box, where it's the opposite when it comes to high-end Android phones. And so even though it was very cool to test the bleeding edge chipsets when it comes to these newer Android phones, it's a lot easier to play on an Odin 2 Portal just because this chipset is more widespread and it's had more time to bake. And I think that those are factors that need to be considered when you're picking up something specifically for gaming. The way I see it, if you are going to pick up a phone like this, there's a couple things to think about. Number one is the fact that yes, when it comes to Android gaming, you will likely be able to play the latest and greatest, but when it comes to emulation, you're better off just waiting a little bit for compatibility to improve. So I wouldn't get this phone for something like Nintendo Switch emulation, but I think that maybe a year or two from now, this chipset may be very good for it. And I think as far as phones go, this is a pretty great experience. My only complaints have to do with the fact that it's very gamery. Like, it likes to remind you that it's a gaming phone, with like the fact that it turns on sounds when you have certain features enabled, and then also the fact that it doesn't have a micro SD card slot, which is going to limit your storage. Anyway, let me know what you think about the Snapdragon 8 Elite chipsets. Have you tried one before? And what do you think in terms of Android gaming and things like PC gaming? And then finally, also, emulation and the compatibility that comes with it. I was honestly thinking that this thing would be a monster out of the box, and I was surprised to find that, man, it gave me a lot more issues than I thought just because it is so bleeding edge. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.